Hello and welcome to this Envato Tuts Plus course. I'm Adi Purdila, and in this course you'll learn about 8 essential CSS libraries that you, as a web designer, should be using today. These libraries will speed up and simplify your workflow and cover topics like style reset, animations, icons, responsive typography, and more. Here's a detailed look at what you'll be learning. First, I'll give you a very quick intro to working with Node and NPM because some of these libraries can only be installed from the NPM repository. Then, in Lesson 2, you'll learn about the first library in this course, Modern Normalize, which is a reset. Lesson 3 is all about Animate.css, an amazing animation library created by Dan Eden. Lesson 4 brings us to the very popular font Awesome, which is a massive icon library. In Lesson 5, you'll learn how to create responsive typography by using a library called RFS. In Lesson 6, you'll be introduced to Bourbon, which is a Sass toolset. Lesson 7 is all about grid systems, and here you'll learn how to use Raster, which is a grid system based on CSS grid layout. In Lesson 8, you'll learn how to add some amazing CSS spinners to your website by using SpinKit, a library developed by Tobias Allen. And finally, in Lesson 9, you'll learn about MQSCSS, which is a Sass library for managing media queries. We have a lot to go through, so let's kick things off with the first lesson, where you'll learn about Node.js and managing CSS libraries with it. See you there. Hello and welcome to the first lesson of this course, where you'll learn a little bit about Node.js, NPM, and how to use these to install some of the CSS libraries from this course. Now, I say some libraries because a few of them will be installed by linking directly to a CSS file. But whenever that's not available, we'll be using NPM. So let's get started. First of all, what is Node and what is NPM? Well, without getting into too much detail, Node.js is a JavaScript runtime environment that's built on Chrome's JavaScript engine. And Node can be used to create scalable network applications. Now, NPM stands for Node Package Manager, right? And it's like this big repository that will hold various packages for CSS libraries, JavaScript plugins, and so on. Now, both of these are free, and you'll usually be using them with the command line from your computer. It doesn't matter if it's a Mac, a Windows machine, or a Linux machine. So how do you get started? Well, first of all, regardless of whether you're on Windows, Mac, whatever, you need to install Node.js. So go to nodejs.org and make sure you download this version, recommended for most users because it is the most stable. And once you do that, you would open up your terminal and you would do something like this, node-v. And if it gives you a version number, then you will know that it's installed correctly on your system. And you can do the same with npm, npm-v. Also, if it gives you a version number, then it's installed correctly and you can start working with it right away. I have an older version of Node here compared to the existing one, but it's totally fine. I'm not going to reinstall this on my system all over again. Now, let's say that you have these installed, okay? How do you use NPM? Well, first of all, you have to navigate from your terminal to your working directory. And you do that with a command called cd, change directory. I'm going to go to my desktop and I'm going to open a folder called testing npm, which currently is a blank folder. Let's find a package on npm and install that on our system. So let's search, for example, for Bootstrap. And here we go. The first item on the list takes us to the official NPM page for the Bootstrap CSS framework. And from here, you actually have some very straightforward directions. You just copy this command, you go back to your terminal, you paste that in. You can also do install here. It's the same thing, but I is just a shorthand. So you would hit enter, and that's it. Now, if we navigate to my testing npm folder in the desktop, you'll find a package block.json file. This is used to manage dependencies, and we'll find the node modules folder. And inside Bootstrap, and here you can find all the CSS and JavaScript files related to that Bootstrap library. From here, you just grab whatever files you need, you include them in your HTML files, and you're good to go. Now, if you don't want to use the command line and you're using a Mac, you can use an app called CodeKit. I highly recommend this app. It's not free, unfortunately, but it's not too expensive either for what it does. Essentially, CodeKit, has a built-in npm system, right? So you don't have to use the terminal. What you do, and let me just open CodeKit here. What you do is you go to this page, which manages npm packages. You search for a specific package, for example, Bootstrap. You select the one that you need, and you just hit install. And it's going to do exactly the same thing that we did with the command line. So that's an alternative. CodeKit does, of course, a lot more than just managing npm packages. It does a live server, so you can do browser refresh as you're editing files. It compiles CSS, LESS files, a bunch of things. So this lesson is not about CodeKit, but this is a must-have tool if you're a developer and you're using macOS. If you're using Windows, I'm afraid you're out of luck, or Linux, because this is Mac only. So if you're using the other operating systems, you can use the command line to manage npm packages. Now, for the rest of this course, I'll be using CodeKit to install those packages that can only be added via npm. All right, and that's how you can use Node.js and npm to download and use CSS libraries. Now, in the next lesson, you'll learn about the first library in our list, which is Modern Normalize. See you there. Welcome back to the course. In this lesson, you'll learn about Modern Normalize. This is a reset file that will make sure you always start a web project with a clean slate in terms of styling. So let's see how we can download it, what it's doing, and how we can benefit from it. We can find Modern Normalize at this address on GitHub. You'll also find a link in the lesson notes. And basically, this is an updated version of Normalize CSS, which is this reset file. So I recommend you get this version. It's more up to date than the default Normalize file, and it continues to be maintained. So a couple of different ways to get this library. You can grab it via npm, just like I showed you in the previous lesson, or you can manually download it, or you can get it from a CDN, which is the version that I prefer. So just click this link, copy it, and then let's go back to our page. I have a simple demo page opened up here. It's just a page with some random elements, and I try to be as diverse as possible so you can see the immediate effects of this reset file. So we're going to go ahead in the head portion of our page, and I'm going to say link. I'm going to paste that in, and that's it. Now, if we go back, you'll immediately see the styling of the elements has changed. We no longer have that serif typeface being used. Instead, we're using a sans. The form elements look different. The headers, the text, everything. So let me quickly comment this so you can see the before. So this is the before. And this is the after. Big difference, right? And it's going to look the same on pretty much every single browser. Now, let's take a look at what exactly is happening in this reset file. I just opened this in a code editor, and let's quickly go through it. First of all, it's setting box sizing to border box. This is something I always do in my projects. It makes it so much easier to work with paddings and borders and widths if you set it like so. Then it's setting line height to a predefined value on the HTML element. It resets some margin. It sets the system UI typeface on the body element. And then you'll see that because it's a reset file, it basically just resets the styling on certain elements, like setting a height 0 on the horizontal rule, setting some typefaces on code elements, and so on and so forth. It's not a very big file, but all of these changes are researched and are proven to work very well. So you should definitely use this every time you're starting a new web project. All right, and that is Modern Normalize, a very useful library for when you want to start a new project with a clean slate. Now, in the next lesson, you'll learn about Animate.css, which is a fantastic animation library created by Dan Eden. So I'll see you there. Welcome back to the course. In this lesson, you'll learn how to add animations and transitions using Animate.css. This is a fantastic library created by Dan Eden, and it's been around for quite some time now. So let's see how it all works. If you go to this GitHub page, you'll find a link in the lesson notes. You'll see a preview of what you can do with Animate.css. Basically, you select your animation from this list, and you can see a preview right here. Pretty cool, right? Now, to get started, we're going to visit the official GitHub repository. And of course, you can get it via NPM or Yarn, or you can get the version hosted on CDN, which is what I recommend. So let's grab this and let's go to our project file. I'm just going to paste it right here. In this project, I'm loading Modern Normalize that I covered in the previous lesson as a reset. I'm going to be doing this for the rest of the course. And then I just loaded Animate.css, and I'm loading my own minified version of the style.css file that I have here. In terms of markup, I just have a grid with 2 containers inside, which I'll use to demonstrate this CSS library. So let's start with the following. I'm going to create an H1 with a class of Animate.css, and to this, I'm going to add the classes of animated, and then the name of the animation that I want to use. Let's select, for example, bounce. So now when I go back, you briefly saw the animation. Let's go again. And that's it. You just start with the class of animated, and then you add the animation that you want to use. Let's use Flash, for example. There we go. Now, this animation only runs once by default, but you can change that by adding specialized classes. Infinite will just run the animation indefinitely. And let's go back to bounce. See, so it just runs indefinitely. And you also have some classes to control the animation delay and the animation speed. So to control the delay, you would do delay dash and the number of seconds. Let's say 3 seconds, for example. So now my animation will start 3 seconds after the page was loaded. And I can also do slow to reduce the speed of the animation. Notice right now it's much slower. Now you have some additional classes that you can use. Let me just show you. If you go to the official GitHub repository, you can find the classes here. So for delay, you can go from 1 to 5 seconds using delay dash 1 second, 2 seconds, and so on. And for speed, you can use the classes of slow, slower, fast, and faster. And you can see the speed time right here. Now, if you don't want to use these classes, you can control these properties via CSS directly. So for example, I can delete these classes, just leave the animation class. And then in here, I can say h1 animated. I can set animation duration, let's say 5 seconds. Let's say animation delay, 1 second. And animation iteration count, let's set it to 2. So that means my animation will unfold over 5 seconds. It's going to have a 1 delay start from when I refresh my page, and it's going to repeat 2 times. Let's go back and let's do a refresh here. That was the delay. That was the animation duration. And here it goes the second time. And that's it. Now it's going to stop. Now, these animations can also be added dynamically via JavaScript. So in the second container, I'm going to add an anchor tag with an ID of button and with a class of button. And I'm just going to say href. We don't really care about that. I'm going to say submit form. This is just a demo button that I've styled to look like this. So what I want to do is when I click this button, I wanted to add an animation to it. I want it to shake, right? So very easy to do that. In my script.js, I'm going to say the following: var element document get element by ID, and I'll reference the element with the class of button, or excuse me, it's by ID, so we'll use button there. And then I'm going to say element. We're going to add a click event listener to it, and we're going to create a function here. And inside, we'll start by adding the animation classes. So we'll say element class list add animated, and let's say shake. So let's see if that works. Click. And there it is. Now, if I click it again, it's not shaking anymore because the animation ended. So if we want to restart the animation, we gotta remove that animated class and add it again. So we can do the following: element, add event listener, animation end, and then function. And we can say element, class list, remove, animated, and shake. So this is what happens when I click the button. I add the animation class. And when that animation ends, I remove that class so that when I click the button again, I can re-add the animation class and the animation will be restarted. So now I can click this button as many times as I want, and it's gonna just keep animating. And that wraps up this lesson about Animate.css. Very useful library and definitely a time saver. Now, in the next lesson, you'll learn about the most popular CSS icon library out there, Font Awesome. I'm sure you've heard of it and maybe even used it. So I'll see you in the next lesson. Welcome back to the course. In this lesson, you'll learn how to work with Font Awesome. This is probably the most popular icon library out there, and because the icons are delivered as a font file, it's really easy to work with. Let's check it out. You can find the library at fontawesome.com. I'm sure you've used this before, or at least you've heard of it. And there are two options. You can use it for free with a limited number of icons, or you can go pro, which is obviously a paid version of the library. It costs $100 a year, or $99 a year, but you get a lot more with it. You get way more icons. You have additional icon styles, and more page views, and etc., etc. Now, let me show you how you can work with Font Awesome. The recommended way is to create an account and create a kit. Okay, so I'm going to sign in, and once you're logged in, you can go right here to kits, and as you can see, I have a test kit opened up here, but you can create a new kit if you want to. And my test kit is using the free version of Font Awesome. And if I go to settings, I can always switch from free to pro if that's what I want. Of course, I need to pay for it. And I can choose to switch between a web font or an SVG. Now, what's the difference between these two? Well, web fonts work with CSS. SVGs work with JavaScript. The SVG version of the platform enables features like power transforms, masking, layering, counters. We'll actually demo some of these later in the lesson. The web font is easier to use, and it's probably the option that most people will go for. So for now, let's choose web font. You can choose which version of the framework you want to use, and then you can go ahead and save your changes. Now, once you did that, you can go ahead and copy this script, and then you need to go back to your page, and you can paste it right here in the head of your document. And from here, you are ready to start using Font Awesome. So let's see some examples. I have a simple demo page prepared here with 4 containers, and I just added some simple styling to them. Now, in container number 1, let's add a couple of icons. You do that by using an I with a class of FAS for Font Awesome, and then the class of the icon that you want. And to find the class of the icons, you can go to the Font Awesome website, icons, and you can search for a specific icon here, or you can browse using these filters. I'm going to choose free and maybe solid. And let's choose this address book, for example. I'm going to click on it, and this takes you to the icon page. It gives you all the information you need, including the HTML for it. So let's click that and copy it. You can also download an SVG version of this file, of this icon. And since we're here, we can also check out the other styles for this icon, because most icons come in a variety of styles. You have solid, which is free, regular, then you have light, which is only for pro users, and duotone, which is also for pro. But we're going to choose solid. And by the way, you can also determine what kind of style you're using by the class name. So FAS stands for Font Awesome Solid. FAR stands for Font Awesome Regular. FAL for Light. And FAD for Duotone. We're going to choose Solid. So again, copy this, We're gonna paste it in. And now, just like that, we have an icon. Let's add a couple more icons. And I have a list written down here. We're gonna do FA baseball, like so. And then what do you call it? FA camera retro. All right, so now we have a nice collection of icons. Now, let's talk about sizing these icons. You can do so with specialized classes, like for example, FA-XS. Okay, that's the extra small. Baseball, we'll just keep it at default. The camera will do FA-2X, and that's twice the size of the normal icon. Let's do FA-3X, and let's do FA-10X, right? So we have icons from small to very large. Now, you can also change the size of an icon by changing its font size. In this case, let's do a quick demo inline style, where I'm going to set a font size to, let's say, 200% on this baseball, right? And as you can see, it just got bigger. But where possible, you can use these dedicated classes. And there are a lot more classes than this. If we go back to the documentation and we open sizing icons, you can see that we can go from XS to SM, LG, 2, 3, 5, 7, and 10X. And you can also see all the details in this nifty table right here. Now, how would you go about coloring these icons? Well, let me show you another example. I'm going to include some more icons here. These are just some arrows, which currently look like this. But what if you want to make them each a different color? Well, it's easy. We're working with the web font right now. So all we have to do is change the text color. So we're going to reference these, FA arrow right, and we can do color, let's say, for example, 82B BC. And there we go. And we can do the same for the rest. I just added color to the arrow down and arrow left, and they currently look like this. Now, with Font Awesome, you can also rotate and animate those icons using predefined classes. So in this third container, I'm going to do the following. I'm going to add a couple of icons. All right, so I just added the same icon actually 3 times. And I'm going to show you some interesting classes. You can do a rotation using FA rotate 90, for example, and it's going to rotate it 90 degrees. You can flip it using the class FA flip horizontal, and that's going to be reversed. And you can also flip it both axes. So FA flip both. And now it's upside down. Make sure you check out the official documentation to see all the available classes for rotation. But what about animation? Well, you can do that as well, simply by using a couple of predefined classes. So you can do, for example, or you can use a spinner icon, which looks like this, and you can do FA spin, and that's going to spin it. And you can also do FA spin and FA pulse. And pulse will basically create these animation steps instead of just animating fluidly like this. And of course, you can animate any icon. It doesn't have to be a spinner. So for example, I can use the class of FAA compass, for example. Let's do twice the size. And I can add FA spin to it, and it's just going to rotate it nicely. Now, for the final demo, I'm going to show you some more advanced features of the framework, and we're actually going to switch our platform to the SVG plus JavaScript version, okay? Now, first, for the markup, we're going to create a simple menu bar, and we're going to layer some icons. And layering in Font Awesome basically means just putting one icon on top of the other. And on this first icon, we'll also use an advanced feature called counters. This basically displays a little bubble on top of your icon, displaying, a number or text or whatever you want. Now, currently, this looks something like this. So let's add some quick styling to that. So menu bar, I'm gonna remove the list style and also the margin and padding. And then I'm gonna target each list item. I'm gonna add a simple background to it. Let's do like black with a 0.25% opacity. Let's do a little bit of padding, 1.5 rems, margin bottom 1 pixel to kind of separate the list items, and also cursor pointer. All right, so we're starting to get there. Now, to enable the layering feature, I'm going to go back to my kit, test kit, settings, and I'm going to choose SVG. And then I'm going to hit save changes, and I'm going to do a refresh of my page. And there we go. Of course, the rest of the icons still work, no problem. But now layering is enabled. So I have this nice counter sitting on top of that icon. Finally, let's add some nice hover effects. But actually, before we do that, let me show you how the icons are rendered now. If we do an inspect, you'll see that that I with a class of FAS has been replaced by an inline SVG. So these icons are now rendered using SVGs directly in your page, which is fantastic. All right, let's quickly add some hover transitions or some hover styles. We'll say menu bar, list item hover, and we'll target everything. We'll target the I, we'll target the SVG, and we'll target the FA layers elements. And I'm just gonna say transform. Let's do a translate 3D. Let's move it to the left by 4 pixels, 0, 0. To the right, excuse me. And now we just have to do this menu bar list item, and I'm gonna just select everything for the sake of this demo, and I'm gonna add a transition to it. Transform, 0.2 seconds, easy out. All right, so with that, we've just added this nice transformation on hover. Now, before we wrap up this rather lengthy lesson, let me just quickly mention the current debate that's going on regarding SVG versus fonts when it comes to icons. And in the lesson notes, you'll find a very interesting blog post on the subject, and I strongly recommend you read that. Essentially, more and more developers are starting to lean towards SVG icons nowadays because they're more accessible in terms of performance. They do perform a little bit better than icon fonts, and they are much more scalable. Now, fortunately, Font Awesome gives you the option to use either a web font or the SVG alternative. So personally, I would go for SVG every time. But it really depends on your project and how comfortable you are with working with SVGs. But go ahead and check out that article and read more about this topic. They really break it down and give you a lot of useful information. All right, and that's a, not very quick look at Font Awesome, but hopefully a very informative one. This is one of those CSS libraries I always find myself reaching for because it's really easy to use, and the icon collection is massive, and it's free. Now, our next library is used for creating responsive typography, and it's called RFS. That stands for Responsive Font Size. Let's learn more about it in the next lesson. See you there. Welcome back to the course. In this lesson, you'll learn about a library called RFS, which stands for Responsive Font Size. Now, even though it's called like that, RFS can actually rescale any property value that supports units. So you can use it for width, height, margin, padding, and so on. Let's check it out. If you check out the lesson notes, you'll find a link to RFS on GitHub. And to get started, to install it, it's really simple. We can install it via npm. So let's open up CodeKit. If you're using Windows or you don't have CodeKit, you can use the terminal to install it, just like I showed you in the first lesson. But in my case, I'm just gonna go in here and search for RFS. And this is the one. I'm gonna choose install. Cool. So now this created a node modules folder. And inside we have RFS, and we can just link to the SAS file from our own style sheet. All right. Now, I have a simple demo prepared here, and I'm going to start by going into my SCSS file, and I'm going to say import RFS /SCSS. And that should be the end of it. So now, to demonstrate what we can do with this library, I'm gonna style this piece of content using RFS. And this is what it currently looks like. And we want to style it in such a way that when it's resized, the font size and the margins and the padding will be affected as well. So let's start with the headings, H1. Instead of setting the font size directly, I'm going to use a mixin from the library. And the mixin is called font size. And I just specified the one that I want on larger screens, which is 3ems. And the mixin is going to do everything else from there. Let's also set a font weight to 500. Okay, let's repeat this process for the other two headings. So H2, I'm going to start with a 2.4 rem, and the weight is going to be 300. And the H3, we'll do a 2 rem initial font size with a font weight of 300 as well. All right, so here's what it currently looks like. And you'll see if I open up the inspector here, you'll see that as I'm resizing this parent and I go below the value of, I believe is 1200 pixels, the font size for these headings will change. See? See how it gets smaller and smaller? That's pretty cool, right? Let's actually inspect this element and check out the computed style. So the font size is currently 45. And as I'm moving, See how it changes? It's now 37. And it goes even lower than that. But as you can see, it doesn't change like dramatically. It's just gradually getting smaller and smaller. All right, so let's style the rest of the content. Let's add a background color to the to that card, to that container. Let's also set a max width of about 50 rems, maybe a border radius. These don't really matter right now. What does matter is margin and padding, and I'm going to use also mix-ins from the library to add responsive padding and responsive margin. All right, yet again, let's check out the computed values here. Okay, so we start with a margin and a padding of 48, and notice that after I dip below 1200 pixels, let me switch this back on, those values will start to change. See? Padding, margin. And you can also see it visually, right? They're getting smaller and smaller. They're now at 34 pixels. So it works. Let's also style this button as a final addition. So a button. Let's also set some padding to this one. Let's say 1 rem, 2 rem. And by the way, you can input values like this, just like you would normally. So 1 rem goes top bottom, 2 rems go, or 2 rem goes left and right. And finally, let's just add the rest of our CSS here. Nothing fancy, just making a pill button, setting some borders, some colors, and a nice transition on hover. Okay, and now you'll notice that even the button will resize. It's gonna change its padding when we're resizing its parent element. Cool. Now, what about configuration for this particular plugin? Well, you can change a couple of things from it. For example, the unit that's using to render the new CSS, the breakpoint at which the changes happen, the breakpoint unit, and also the factor, among others. So the way to override these properties is to define them before you import the actual files. So RFS unit. Let's set this to pixels, and you can set them to pixels or rems. Without this, the units being used are rems by default, right? You can see 1.425 rems plus 2.1 viewport width. This is how the font size is calculated, for example, on the H1. So this mixin generates this code along with a media query. So include font size 3 rems basically means that when I have a minimum width of 1200 pixels, use 3 rems. But the rest of the time, calculate this, this dynamic value. So if we're gonna set the RFS unit to pixels, you'll notice that instead of rems, we now have 22.8 pixels. But I recommend you leave this set to rems. It's better like that. Now, if you want to change the breakpoint at which changes happen, you can do RFS breakpoint 1300, for example. By default, it's 1200. So now you'll see that changes are gonna start happening here when I go below 1300 and not 1200. Okay, so we're getting closer. And now I'm at 1200. And if I go 1 pixel less, you'll see that in the inspector here, the paddings and margins are starting to change. So that's how you can edit this breakpoint. You can also change the breakpoint unit, right? So instead of pixels, you can choose ems or rems. And by breakpoint unit, I mean this bit where it says minimum width. Yeah, by default, it's set to pixels, 1300, but I can change it to rems, and it's going to look like that. Or I can change it to just ems, and it's going to look like that. Personally, I just leave it on to default, which is pixels. And finally, you can change a property called the factor. Now, this will determine how dramatic the change is. Okay, so how fast are the property values changed? I think by default it's 10. I bumped it up to 100, and you can play around with this and really determine just how much difference you want between the original state and the responsive state of an item. And if you check out the official repository here on GitHub, you're gonna find the other configuration properties you can use. They're all down here. All right, and that's it for RFS, a very handy library for creating responsive typography and more. Now, time to move on, and our next library is called Bourbon. It has nothing to do with the drink, but everything to do with Sass, because it is a toolset based on the very popular preprocessor. More about that in the next lesson. See you there. Welcome back to the course. In this lesson, you'll learn about a very powerful Sass toolset called Bourbon. This is basically a collection of Sass mixins and functions you can use to speed up development. So let's check it out. You can find the library at bourbon.io. And to get started with the installation, we're going to use npm. So I'm going to open up CodeKit, and I'm going to search for Bourbon, and I'm going to install it. And then I'm going to open up my Sass file, and I'm going to say import Bourbon. And that's it. Now, in this file, I've defined a couple of color variables and some demo styles for this page. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start styling these elements using mostly Bourbon mixins and functions. So let's get started. In this first box here, I have a circle and a rectangle. So let's target those, circle. I'm going to use these mixins in no particular order. It's just how it's more convenient. So to size, or to set the width and height of a specific element, you can use the size mixin. And if I'm going to set 10 rems here, it's going to set the width and the height to 10 rems. Then you can change the border color by using the border color mixin. And here I'm just going to choose color 1. And I'm just going to switch back and forth between the style CSS and the SCSS so you can see what Bourbon is doing. So by setting these two mixins, it added height, width, and border color to my circle element. Cool. Let's set the border style. You can use a mixin called border style. And you can set solid, and that should do it for now. And let's do include border width. Oops, it was the other way around. So border width, let's do 10 pixels. And also let's create a circle by adding border radius 50%. Okay, so there we go. We have a nice circle. Now you might be saying, okay, Adi, but you know, border color, style, width, you can set it with normal properties. So why should we use the mixins? Well, the mixins come in handy when you have more than one value. So they simplify the way you write CSS. Let's target that rectangle for now. And for rectangle, let's say we want different sizes for width and height. So you can say include size, 5 rems and 8 rems, right? What about border color? Well, let's do border color, but let's use like color 1, color 2, 3, and 4. Okay, let's set some different border styles. Let's do solid, dashed, and on the bottom, let's do no border. And let's set the border width to, let's say, 10 pixels, top, bottom, 15 pixels, side to side. So now this generates these properties, and the result is this, right? So I find it simpler to just use this mixin than to write these myself. They take up less space as well. Now let's move on to box number 2. Here we have a bunch of buttons. We have a traditional button, an input type button, an input type reset, and one type submit. Now normally to style all of these the same, I would have to go in and write button, input type button, and so on. But with Bourbon, we have a very easy way of targeting all of this. All we have to do is this, hashtag all buttons, and this automatically selects all of these button types. So let's say, for example, I want to set the border to none. I can do that, or I can use the mixin. And as you can see in CSS, we have button, type reset, type submit. Pretty cool. So let's add some more styles to these. Let's add a background color. Let's say color 1. Let's add a border radius, 4 pixels. Cursor, pointer. Let's add a transition. Let's add outline none. This is for Chrome. Let's add a padding, right? We can use the padding mixin. Let's say 1 rem, top, bottom, 2 rems, side to side. We can do margins, right? We can do null, that's top, right, and left, and we can do 1 rem for the bottom. So now this is what our buttons look like. And since we're on the buttons, let me show you another very cool mixin. That's the contrast switch. So the contrast switch works something like this. Color, and instead of saying, you know, white or black or whatever color we want to use for the text, we can say contrast switch, and we're going to specify the color of our background. And then we can go right here and we can add some additional variables called contrast switch, dark color, and here I'm going to use an RGBA of 53, 56, 71.8, right? So basically a dark color. And then I can do contrast switch light color, and here I'm just going to do just pure white. Okay, so this is the way it works. The mixin will actually calculate the contrast between the value that we just set and these two variables. And whichever color gives us the greatest contrast, that's the one that's going to be used. Okay, so in our case, we're using color 1, which is this blue, right? And apparently the black text color works better. But if we're going to switch and we're going to add a dark color to the button, and we're going to switch it up here as well, then the buttons will use the light color, the white. So very handy plugin for, when you want to keep color accessibility for your projects. Very cool. Now also, since we're on the topic of buttons, we can also do this. All buttons hover. And for example, I can change the background color to, let's say, a shade of that original color one. And I'm going to explain what that's doing in just a little bit. And now we have a hover state. So all buttons hover, this nice function right here will basically generate this piece of code. It takes all of the buttons and adds their hover state. So what about this shade? Well, shade is a function that takes a color and blends it with a specific amount of black. In this color, in this example, 10%. I can also do all buttons active. So when we click on them, and I can change their background color to a tint of color 1, let's say with 20%, but this time it's with white. So shade mixes a color with black, tint mixes a color with white. So now on click, we have a different color. Pretty cool. Let's move on to box number 3. Here we have a bunch of inputs. Type text, password, email, number, and text area. Well, these are text inputs. So to target these, I can do this. Hashtag, curly braces, $, all text inputs. And let's say, for example, I don't have a border on them. Well, if we look on the CSS file, this selects a lot more inputs than I have here. Color, date, date time local, and so on. So very, very powerful mix-in. So for these, let's add some styling, like a background color, border radius, a transition, a nice margin and padding, and also I can target their hover state with all text inputs hover. And I'm just using the shade function here. And the result is this. Pretty cool, right? Finally, let's move on to box number 4, which has a bunch of headings from H1 to H6. Now, on these headings, I can set with Bourbon different font stacks, and also I can use the modular scale function to apply different font sizes to these headings so they match those in a modular typographic scale. How cool is that? So here's how this works. First, let's target H1 through H6. And to set the font stack, you can use something like font family and then font stack Helvetica. This is one of the predefined font stacks. And that will basically change the font family to a font stack. Helvetica New, Helvetica Arial, and finally sans serif. And if you don't know what a font stack is, it's basically telling the browser, hey, I want the font family to be Helvetica New. Is this not available? Okay, then use Helvetica. If Helvetica is not available, use Arial. If Arial is not available, use whatever sans serif font you have. Now, there is a big list of font stacks, and they look something like this. Lucida Grand, Verdana, System Garamond, and so on. So if we activate Monaco, for example, these headings will now look different. Now let's talk about that modular scale, because I think that's probably the coolest part about all this. Let me start off by adding these variables here for your reference. These are known modular scales, right? We start from minor second, which has this ratio, and we go all the way up to double octave, which is 4. Probably the most used ones are somewhere in this range, right? Going from minor third, yes, to the golden ratio, which is 1.618. Now, what exactly is this modular scale thing? I've never heard about it. Well, let me show you a quick example. I'm going to go to typescale.com, and here you can see the concept illustrated nicely. You start with a base font size and with a scale. And then each font size is set based on that scale. So we start with 16 pixels. The next font size will be 16 times 1.333. That gives us this value. The next value is 21.33 pixels times the same ratio, 1.333. And that gives us this value. And so on and so forth until we get to the very top. So Bourbon has a type scale implemented, and it's really easy to use it. All you have to do is go font size, modular scale, and then you would set the position and then the actual scale that you want to use. So in my case, I want to use minor second, and this gives me this result. Now, if I want to, I can give this up completely, and the scale that's being used is totally different. I think by default it's 1.414, but I can go up here and I can change that. I can say Bourbon, and I can set modular scale ratio to whatever value I want. Let's say 1.333. I'm going to save that. And now we get different values for these headings. I can change it to something smaller, let's say 1.2, and that's going to change the scale here. I can go 1.125, which is this major second, and it's going to give me this result. So this is a cool way of generating modular scales with Sass. And that's Bourbon. Pretty cool library, right? Definitely a big time saver for larger projects where you need to write a lot of CSS. Now, we've covered 5 libraries so far, but none of them was about grid systems. When discussing essential CSS libraries, we should definitely include one that allows us to create grids, because these are fundamental to any layout. So, in the next lesson, you'll learn how to work with the Raster grid system. See you there. Welcome back to the course. In this lesson, you'll learn how to use the Raster grid system for creating layouts. This is based on CSS Grid Layout, is very powerful, and it has a pretty unique syntax. Let's find out more. You can get the Raster grid system at this address right here, where you can also find a demo and, of course, a general explanation of how everything works. And to download it, you just click this button. You download the CSS file directly, just like I did, and you'll see that I have a raster.grid.css file all ready to go in my project folder. So now all I have to do is say link raster.grid.css, and now I'm ready to go. Now, just a quick note before we get started. When you download this archive, it contains 2 CSS files. It has that raster grid CSS, which I showed you, and that's just the grid, the essential functionality of the grid. There's also a CSS file called raster2.css, Animate.css. That adds a small framework you can use, but we're not gonna bother with that. For now, just use Raster Grid CSS. So let's see how this thing works. The syntax is pretty interesting. You start with an element called rGrid. This is a custom element. And to it, you set how many columns you want in your grid. And then you define your cells with the element rCell. So let's grab a couple of these. Let's actually do it this way. I believe it's the syntax. Yeah. So rCell will basically create the cells. So now, here's our grid. Now let's add some very simple styling so that we can see our grid better. Now this has nothing to do with the grid itself. It's just so that we can better see the columns. So on rCell, I'm simply going to add a background color, and I'm going to add color white. For the text, let's do a border radius, 4 pixels, align the text in the center, maybe a little bit of padding, and a little bit of margin. All right. So now this shows us exactly how the grid works. We have the cells being displayed like this. And because I was saying that this is based on CSS grid layout, we can actually target the grid, and we can set a grid gap. Let's say 1 rem. Cool. So let's see what kind of layouts we can create with this. Well, let's do an rGrid again, set 12 columns, and then we can do rCell. If you do it like this, it's gonna span 1 cell by default. But you can specify how big you want this by using span 4, for example, and this will span 4 columns like this, right? So it goes 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's do another rCell, and this is 1 cell by default. And you can also do rCell span equals 7-12. This will basically mean that it starts in column 7 and end in column 12, right? So it starts here and it ends here. You can also do the following. Let's create another grid with 12 columns. And by the way, you can create as many columns as you want. You're not limited to 12. I chose 12 because it's an easily divisible number. So you can create an rCell where the span is, for example, 1 plus 3. This means it starts in 1 and spans 3 columns, right? As you can see here. Also, what you can do is rCell span equals 4 ... That means it starts in number 4 and span the rest of the row. Right, so any number ... it's going to start in that number and span the rest of the row. All right, so that's the basic functionality of the grid, or the basic syntax of this grid. You create an rGrid container, you set the number of columns, and then you would define your cells. And using the span attribute, you would define how big those cells should be. Now, there are also some responsive characteristics to this grid, because this is a responsive grid. And the first one is you can set columns -s for small equals, let's say, 6. That means that when resized, Okay, this grid will now have 6 columns instead of 12 on small screens. So anything that's less than appears 600 pixels. Anything bigger than 600 pixels gets the normal 12 columns. You can also define different spans for different screen sizes. So for example, here you can say span -s equals, let's say 1 through 6. So on small screens, we go 1 through 6. And this, we can say span s equals 7 through 12. So we're basically dividing this in two. Okay, so on large screens, we have 2 columns like this, 1 through 3 and 4 through 12. And on small screens, we have an equal number of columns, 3 and 3. And you can play around with these. You can get the grid dialed in just the way you need it. And if you want to configure it, you can go to the official web page here. And if you scroll all the way down, you can actually change some values. Like instead of the R prefix, you can do RG for raster grid. And it's going to change the CSS file for you. How many columns do you want by default? Maybe you want 12 or 22 or whatever. What are the breakpoints that you want to use? 600 is for small screens, 1600 for large ones. You can change the grid attributes, the cell attributes, and the suffixes. And once everything is configured, you just click here, copy, and you paste it in here. You just replace this with the updated version. And that's it for the raster grid system. Pretty powerful, right? And I think it's actually very intuitive and easy to use. Now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about loaders. I'm sure that at some point you needed one of those spinning circles to visually describe a loading state. Well, the next library offers a lot of different spinners, all made with CSS. That's coming up in the next lesson. Welcome back to the course. In this lesson, you'll learn how to add some amazing CSS spinners to your website. And while there are tons of libraries out there that offer this, for this course I chose one that's called SpinKit, and it's made by Tobias Allen. So let's check it out. You can find SpinKit at tobiasallen.com/SpinKit, and here you can see a very nice demo of all the loaders that are offered in this library. So let me quickly show you how to download these and how to work with them. We'll install this library via npm. So I'm going to open up my CodeKit app here, and I'm going to choose SpinKit, install. All right, and then back in the code editor, I'm going to go in here, create a link, and for href, we're going to navigate to Node Modules, SpinKit, and we're going to choose spinkit.css. And if we open this file, we can see exactly how these kits are created. And the author gives us the exact markup that we need, the actual HTML markup we need in the CSS file. So when we find a loader that we like, we simply copy this HTML and paste it in our own document. So let's go ahead and do that right now. I'm going to start here with a simple spinner, and that's called skplain. And that result looks like this. Now, just in case the color is not correct, there are two ways we can change that. We can either edit the original CSS file. As you can see here, Tobias uses CSS variables to define the colors. So, you can grab a different color from here. Or, just in case you don't want to tamper with original source files, you can go into your CSS file and you can target that element, and you can simply set a background color to whatever you want. Let's say D75S62. And that will give us the color that we want. Now, of course, how you edit these colors will depend from kit to kit, basically, from loader to loader. You just have to see what kind of structure it has and what elements receive the SK color variable. In this case, for example, it's the before pseudo element of SK chase dot. All right, so let's add some more spinners to our website because we have a lot of room here. And let me just pop this over to the other side. So on this next one, I want to include the chase loader, and the chase loader looks something like this. So just copy it from there, paste it in, and now if we do a refresh, we can barely see it here. So let's actually use this same color and apply it to every single spinner that we'll be creating, so we can we can actually see what we're doing. Okay, on the third one, I'm going to choose a spinner that is called swing. So let's see if we can find it here. Swing, there we go. So just copy that, paste it in. And for the fourth one, I'm going to choose one that's called a cube grid, or actually a grid. So just copy this and paste it wherever you need it. And now we have 4 spinners. It's that easy to add them. Now, before we wrap up this lesson, I just want to make a quick mention. When getting the HTML for these spinners, get it either from the official GitHub page, right? You'll see all of the examples here, or get it directly from CSS, just like I did here, because the sources that you get from the website are not actually correct. Probably the author forgot to update these sources. So either get them from GitHub or from the original CSS file. All right, and that's it for SpinKit. Pretty cool loaders, very well made. I highly recommend this library. Now, for our 8th and final piece of the puzzle, we'll discuss about media queries. These sit at the foundation of every responsive website out there. And while it's totally possible to write them in plain CSS, using a dedicated Sass library will definitely speed up the process. So in the next lesson, you'll learn how to use the MQ.SCSS library. See you there. Welcome back to the course. In this lesson, you'll learn about a CSS library called MQ.SCSS. This is used for simplifying the creation of media queries with some very well thought out mix-ins. So let's check it out. You can find the library at this address on GitHub, and we're gonna go ahead and load it via npm. So I'm gonna open CodeKit, and the name is MQ.SCSS. There we go. Let's install that. All right. Now let's go into our Sass file here, and we're going to say import, and we'll go to node modules, MQ.SCSS, and we're going to load MQ, just like that. Now I've prepared a very simple demo for you today. We have 4 divs with a class of container, and each one has a different ID. Small, medium, medium, large, and large. Now, currently, we cannot see any of these because they all have an opacity of 0. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show these containers in their correct screen size. So, for example, the container with an ID of small, I only want to show it on small screens that have under 480 pixels of width. And we can do that very easily with the MQ mixin. So here's what you do here. You specify if it's a minimum or a maximum. In my case, I want it to be a maximum. And then you will specify the breakpoint. Now, the library doesn't have any predefined breakpoints. You need to do that yourself. So let's go ahead and do that right now. Breakpoint small, I'm going to do 480. Breakpoint medium, I'm going to do 800. And breakpoint large, I'm going to do 1200. So right here, I want to say BP small, and I'm going to say opacity 1. So what does this mixin do? Well, it generates a media query that looks like this. Media, max width 480 pixels, and then it's setting opacity 1 on the small element. So it goes from this to this. So now, if I go under 480, there it is. It tells me, hey, you're now on a small screen. Let's do the same for the other ones. Medium. This should be displayed on small to medium screens that are between 480 and 800. We can do that very easily. Include MQ. I can say inside two values, BP small, BP medium. It doesn't matter which order I choose. Opacity 1. So now I'm on small to medium screens between 480 and 800. You'll see that when I resize this to 801, yeah, my container disappears. What about the large one or the medium large? Medium large should be between 800 and 1200, and it will do the same thing. Include MQ inside BP medium to BP large. See how easy it is to create media queries with this tool? Opacity 1. So now we have medium to large screens. And for large screens, I can say include MQ, min, and by the way, you can use min width here as well. It works. Or here you can say max width. It's exactly the same thing. So here we're going to say min BP large, and we're going to set opacity to 1. So anything that's above 1200 pixels is now on large screens. So this is how you can use this Sass library to easily create media queries. Now, there are a lot more rules you can use. You can use min or max height. You can go for ratios. Everything is nicely documented on the official GitHub page for the library. You can see there are a lot of things you can do with media queries. What I showed you here is a very simple demo, but probably is the use case for most people. So I hope you found it useful. All right, and that's it for the media queries library, and also for this course. I've been using most of these libraries for a long time, and I can say with absolute certainty that, at least for me, they are essential. I want to thank you very much for watching this course. I'm Adi Pordila, and until next time, take care.